My name is Leah Martinez, and at 62, I thought I knew my family. I was wrong. My dad shoved my 9-year-old daughter at Christmas dinner and said, "That seat's for my real grandkid. Get out." She hit the floor hard. Her knee made this awful sound against the hardwood. Everyone just froze. My mom kept cutting her turkey. My sister Chelsea didn't even look up from her phone. See, for 5 years, my parents controlled my grandfather's trust as trustees. Chelsea got money whenever she asked, new kitchen, down payment, whatever she wanted. I got excuses. When I needed help choosing between heating bills and prescription copays, they said the trust couldn't help me. But I didn't cry that Christmas. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder. Set it right between the cranberry sauce and the good china. "Dad," I said, real quiet. "You've been served." My mom's wine glass hit her plate. Clink. My dad went white as his napkin. That folder held 5 years of evidence. Bank records, trust documents, proof that they'd given Chelsea $180,000 from my inheritance. While I lived on Social Security and Medicare supplements, begging for crumbs and saying, "Thank you." They thought I'd never fight back. They were wrong about that too. What happens when the people who share your blood are the ones stealing your future? If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The December wind cut through Chicago's suburbs like a promise of change. Leah Martinez stood in her parents' driveway, gripping a casserole dish that had gone cold during the drive. At 62, she still checked her tote 3 times before entering their house. Her fingers found the familiar shapes inside the weekly pill organizer with its Monday through Sunday compartments. The Medicare card that slipped against her palm like a talisman, the folded SSA letter she couldn't bring herself to throw away. "Just smile," her mother had whispered over the phone that morning. Christmas is about family. Leah's daughter Maisie climbed out of their 10-year-old sedan, tugging at sleeves that hung too long on her 9-year-old frame. The sweater had been a gift from Chelsea last year, one size too big, just like everything else her half-sister offered. Maisie's dark eyes scanned the house with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read rooms before entering them. "Do I look okay?" Maisie asked, smoothing down hair that refused to stay flat. "You look perfect," Leah said, though her chest tightened as she noticed how Maisie's shoulders curved inward, making herself smaller. The front door opened before they reached it. Leah's mother appeared, flour dusting her holiday apron, her smile bright and practiced. "There's my girls," she announced to the hallway, loud enough for the dining room to hear. But her eyes flickered over Maisie with the same quick assessment they'd always held, measuring, calculating, finding something lacking. The house smelled like pine candles and overcooked turkey. Garland draped every doorframe, and glitter scattered the hallway floor like fallen stars. Christmas music played from hidden speakers, the kind of instrumental carols that filled silence without demanding attention. Everything sparkled with the desperate perfection of a holiday that couldn't afford to go wrong. Leah set the casserole on the kitchen counter between towers of serving dishes. Her mother moved with efficient precision, checking timers, adjusting garnishes, orchestrating Christmas like a conductor who had forgotten how to enjoy music. Steam rose from the gravy pot, fogging the window that faced the backyard where snow had settled in neat, undisturbed lines. "Where should we sit?" Leah asked, though she already knew the answer would sting. "The dining room's all set up," her mother replied without meeting Leah's eyes. "Chelsea's family is already here." The dining room table stretched like an altar, covered in the good china that only appeared for holidays and judgments. Chelsea sat at the far end, her blonde hair styled in waves that caught the chandelier light. Her husband Jake laughed at something Leah's father said, the sound too loud and too quick. Their daughter Emma, just 7 years old, occupied the chair beside her grandfather, the seat everyone called holy, because it meant you mattered. Glitter place cards marked each spot with careful calligraphy. Leah's eyes found hers immediately tucked between the salad forks and the wall, where conversations would flow around her rather than through her. Maisie's card sat even farther from the center, near the kitchen door where the serving dishes would block her view. "Is that my name?" Maisie whispered, pointing to her place card. "Yes, baby," Leah lied gently. "That's your seat." Leah's father dominated the head of the table, his silver hair combed back, his red tie perfectly straight. At 78, he still carried himself like a man who owned every room he entered. His fork moved like a conductor's baton as he spoke, punctuating points about the stock market, the weather, the neighbor's poor choice in lawn decorations. Chelsea laughed at each pause, her head tilting in practiced attention. "Dad's always right about these things," she said, reaching for her wine glass. The conversation flowed around topics that excluded by design property values in Chelsea's neighborhood. Emma's private school achievements, the cruise Jake's business was funding. Leah sat quietly, cutting her turkey into small, precise pieces while Maisie pushed food around her plate. "Blood's thicker than eggnog," Leah's father announced suddenly, raising his glass in a toast that felt more like a warning. The adults laughed too quickly, the sound sharp against the crystal. Leah's mother clinked her glass with nervous enthusiasm. Chelsea beamed as though she'd been personally complimented. Jake raised his glass high, playing the part of the son-in-law who understood the family rules. Leah lifted her water glass with steady hands, though her fingers trembled slightly. She caught Maisie's confused expression and offered a small smile that said, "We'll get through this." But Maisie had stopped looking at her plate. Her eyes fixed on Emma's place card, where her own name had been printed in the same careful calligraphy. The holy seat beside their grandfather bore Maisie's name in silver ink, though Emma sat there now, chattering about Christmas morning plans. "Mom," Maisie whispered, so quietly only Leah could hear. "That's my name there." Leah followed her daughter's gaze and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The place card clearly read, "Maisie," in elegant script, positioned in the seat of honor while Emma occupied it like a throne. "Maybe there was a mix-up," Leah murmured, but doubt crept through her voice. Maisie stood before Leah could stop her. She walked around the table with careful steps, her small hand reaching for the place card that bore her name. The adults continued talking, their voices weaving around the child moving through their space like she was invisible. Maisie lifted the card and studied it, her lips moving slightly as she read her own name. Then she looked at Emma, who was coloring on a napkin with crayons that had appeared from somewhere. "Excuse me," Maisie said softly. "I think this is my seat." The conversation stopped like a record player unplugged mid-song. Forks paused midway to mouths. Wine glasses remained suspended in air. Even the Christmas music seemed to lower its volume, waiting for what would happen next. Leah's father set down his fork with deliberate precision. His pale blue eyes locked onto Maisie with the same expression he'd worn when correcting Leah as a child: cold, certain, final. "That seat," he said, his voice carrying across the table like a gavel striking wood, "is for my real grandchild." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Leah's mother's wine glass slipped slightly, clinking against her wedding ring. Chelsea's mouth formed a small "oh" of surprise, though her eyes held no shock at all. Jake suddenly found his dinner fascinating. "Get out," Leah's father continued, his voice growing harder. "Go sit where you belong." Maisie stood frozen, the place card trembling in her small hand. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone who would say this was wrong, that she had every right to sit where her name was written. Nobody spoke. Leah felt her body moving before her mind caught up. She pushed back from her chair, the legs scraping against hardwood like fingernails on a chalkboard. But her father was already standing, his tall frame looming over Maisie's small figure. "I said move," he barked. His hand shot out palm flat against Maisie's shoulder and shoved her backward with the casual force of someone moving an obstacle. Maisie's foot caught the edge of the Persian rug. Her arms windmilled for balance that never came. She fell hard, her knee hitting the hardwood floor with a sound like a breaking branch. The thud echoed in the sudden silence. Maisie's sharp intake of breath cut through the air, followed by the terrible quiet of a child too shocked to cry. Leah's vision tunneled to her daughter on the floor, one hand pressed against her knee, the other still clutching the place card that had caused such offense. Maisie's face crumpled as pain and humiliation crashed over her in waves. Nobody moved. Nobody said, "Stop," or "Enough," or "How dare you." Chelsea examined her manicure. Jake studied his wine glass. Leah's mother clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles went white, but her lips remained sealed. The silence stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of choices everyone was refusing to make. Leah knelt beside her daughter, her knees hitting the same unforgiving floor. She slipped her arms around Maisie's trembling shoulders, feeling the child's rapid heartbeat against her chest. Tasting the salt of tears that hadn't fallen yet. "I've got you," Leah whispered, loud enough for the room to hear truth spoken at least once that evening. She helped Maisie to her feet, checking her knee with gentle fingers that knew how to assess playground injuries and deeper wounds. The skin was already darkening, a bruise blooming like spilled wine against pale skin. Leah's tote bag sat beside her abandoned chair, the same bag that held her pill organizer. Her Medicare card, her SSA letter, all the paperwork that proved she existed, even when others pretended she didn't. But today it held something else, something she had carried for 2 weeks like a loaded gun waiting for the right moment. She reached into the bag's side pocket and withdrew a thin manila folder. The papers inside rustled softly as she set it on the table between the cranberry sauce and the crystal serving platter. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He looked at her with the same dismissive expression he'd worn her entire life, the look that said she was an interruption to more important business. Leah met his eyes without flinching. "You've been served." The words dropped into the decorated silence like stones into still water. Her mother's wine glass slipped from nerveless fingers, hitting her plate with a sharp clink that made everyone jump. Her father's face went pale as winter, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Chelsea leaned forward, her perfect composure finally cracking. "What is that supposed to mean?" But Leah was already moving, her hand finding Maisie's uninjured arm, guiding her daughter toward the hallway that led to the front door. Behind them, voices erupted in confusion and anger, but the words blurred together like competing radio stations. Leah helped Maisie with her coat, her fingers working the zipper with practiced calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. The front door opened to December wind that cut through their holiday clothes like a promise of honesty. They walked to their car through air that smelled like snow and freedom. Leah started the engine and adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the house. Where light spilled from every window, where her family would spend the next hour dissecting what had just happened without ever mentioning a 9-year-old girl's bruised knee. As they drove away, Christmas lights blurred past the windows like fallen stars. Maisie pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the cold surface. "Mom," she said quietly, "what did that folder mean?" Leah glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror, seeing her own dark eyes reflected in a face still too young to understand adult cruelty. The pill organizer rattled softly in her tote as they turned onto their quiet street, where Christmas decorations looked gentler, less demanding. "It means," Leah said, choosing her words carefully, "that some things are about to change." The house they returned to was small, but there's a 2-bedroom condo. Where no one had to earn their seat at the table, where place cards weren't weapons, where Christmas music played softly instead of drowning out unspoken truths. But as Leah helped Maisie onto the couch and positioned an ice pack against her swelling knee, she felt the weight of what she'd set in motion. The folder she'd left behind contained papers that would rip through her family like wildfire, exposing decades of carefully buried secrets. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, covering the suburb in white that would be dirty gray by morning. Inside, the heating unit hummed its familiar tune, and the refrigerator's ice maker dropped cubes with small, comforting sounds. For the first time in years, Christmas Eve was quiet in their home. And in that quiet, Leah heard something she hadn't expected: the sound of her own voice saying, "I've got you," and meaning it completely. The loudest thing in that decorated dining room hadn't been her father's cruel words or Maisie's fall or even the terrible silence that followed. The loudest thing had been the moment Leah finally chose her daughter over her family's approval. And tomorrow, the real consequences would begin. The drive home from her parents' house passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the car's heater and Maisie's occasional sniffles. Leah's hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes fixed on taillights that blurred red through the December darkness. Every streetlight they passed illuminated the tension in her shoulders. The set of her jaw, the way she checked the rearview mirror as though something might be following them. At home, their small condo felt like sanctuary. Leah helped Maisie out of her holiday dress and into soft pajamas with careful attention to the swelling knee. The bruise had deepened to purple-black, an ugly mark that would take weeks to fade. She settled her daughter on the couch with pillows arranged like fortress walls, then retrieved an ice pack from their narrow freezer. "Hold this right here," Leah instructed, positioning the cold pack against the worst of the swelling. 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off. Maisie nodded without complaint, though her dark eyes held a flatness that worried Leah more than tears would have. The child stared at nothing in particular, her small fingers picking at the couch fabric with mechanical precision. Leah moved through their kitchen like someone following a familiar script. She opened the cabinet above the sink and retrieved a mug painted with fading flowers, a Mother's Day gift from 3 years ago when Maisie still believed holidays were magic. Hot chocolate mix swirled in warm milk, the spoon clinking against ceramic in a rhythm that usually brought comfort. But tonight, the normal sounds felt hollow. The refrigerator hummed its eternal tune. The heating unit clicked on and off. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, then settled back into silence. Their small world continued spinning while larger worlds prepared for war. Leah carried the mug to the couch and set it on the coffee table within Maisie's reach. Steam rose from the surface like incense, sweet and warm, but Maisie barely acknowledged it. She stirred the chocolate with a listless hand, watching the liquid swirl without interest. "He doesn't like me," Maisie said finally, her voice small and matter-of-fact. Not a question. A conclusion drawn from evidence that had been building for years. Leah felt something crack inside her chest. She sat on the coffee table's edge, facing her daughter directly, her knees almost touching Maisie's uninjured leg. "Baby," she said carefully, "that's about him. Not you." Maisie's eyes flicked up briefly, then returned to the hot chocolate. "Is it because I'm not real?" The word, real, hung in the air like a curse. Leah heard her father's voice echoing in it, all. The years of implications and half-spoken judgments, the way certain photographs appeared on mantelpieces while others stayed hidden in drawers. "No," Leah said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "You are real. You belong with me. Always." Maisie nodded, but the movement seemed automatic, the gesture of a child who had learned to accept what adults said. Even when her heart held different knowledge. She took a small sip of chocolate and set the mug down carefully, avoiding her mother's eyes. Leah's phone, silent during the drive home, suddenly erupted with light and sound. The screen showed Chelsea's name, then immediately switched to their mother's contact information, then their father's. One call ended and another began, the electronic buzzing filling their quiet living room like an alarm that wouldn't stop. Text messages arrived in rapid succession, each notification causing the phone to vibrate against the coffee table like an angry insect. Leah watched the screen light up repeatedly but made no move to answer. The calls went to voicemail. The texts piled up unread. Finally, silence returned, but it lasted only minutes before a group message thread exploded across her screen. Family members. She barely spoke to suddenly compelled to share their opinions about Christmas dinner drama they'd heard secondhand. "How could you do this on Christmas? You've always been dramatic. Dad's getting older. Show some respect. Think about what this does to the family." Message after message scrolled past, each one a small knife thrust from people who had witnessed years of slights and chosen their comfort over her dignity. Not one asked about Maisie's knee. Not one inquired whether a 9-year-old girl was all right after being shoved to the floor by her grandfather. Leah turned the phone face down on the coffee table, cutting off the stream of judgment and false concern. The sudden quiet felt defiant. "Are we in trouble?" Maisie asked, noticing the tension in her mother's movements. "No, baby," Leah replied, though her voice carried uncertainty she couldn't quite hide. "We're safe." After Maisie finally fell asleep on the couch, her breathing deep and even despite the ice pack that had slipped sideways, Leah returned to her tote bag. It sat by the front door where she'd dropped it, looking innocent as a grocery bag. But inside, nestled between her pill organizer and a receipt from the pharmacy, lay the thing that would change everything. She carried the bag to her small kitchen table and sat in the chair that faced the window. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled in neighbors' windows, warm, inviting, normal. Inside, she spread the contents of her life across the table's surface like evidence in a trial. The weekly pill organizer sat heavy in her palm, each compartment filled with the small realities of aging blood pressure medication, vitamins her doctor insisted she needed, the antidepressant she'd started after last year's particularly dark winter. Monday through Sunday, morning and evening, proof that time moved forward whether you wanted it to or not. Her Medicare card emerged next, the red, white and blue design as familiar as her own reflection. The numbers were memorized, the plastic worn smooth from handling. She set it beside a Medicare EOB she'd received 2 weeks ago, an explanation of benefits for services she couldn't quite remember authorizing, with patient responsibility numbers that made her stomach tighten. The SSA letter came last, unfolded carefully despite its creases from repeated reading. Social Security Administration correspondence always arrived with the weight of judgment, and this one had hit particularly hard. A benefit adjustment that would take effect in January, reducing her monthly payment by $67. Not enough to starve, too much to ignore. These papers formed the landscape of her life at 62: medical bills and government benefits, the careful accounting of someone living on margins that grew thinner each year. But tonight, they served as backdrop for something far more dangerous. The manila folder appeared unremarkable next to the official documents. Thin, standard office supply, the kind used for organizing bills or keeping children's school papers. But inside lay dynamite disguised as legal documents. Leah opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. The papers inside carried the formal weight of the court system embossed seals. Precise legal language, numbered paragraphs that read like architectural blueprints for destroying a family. At the top of the first page, printed in official font, were the words that had taken her 2 weeks to find courage to file: petition for full accounting of trust and removal of trustees. Below that, in smaller text, Martinez Family Trust, established 1987. Her grandfather's name appeared in careful legal language, alongside details she'd memorized through sleepless nights: trust principle at time of death, intended beneficiaries, the duties and obligations of appointed trustees. Words that transformed family relationships into legal contracts, love into fiduciary responsibility. The petition requested emergency relief, immediate freezing of all trust assets, production of complete financial records, removal of current trustees for breach of duty, and full accounting of all distributions made since her grandfather's death 5 years ago. At the bottom of the final page, her signature appeared in ink that had barely dried when she'd filed the papers that morning. Rebecca Shaw's firm stamp marked the documents as official, ready to detonate in courtrooms and family dinners alike. Leah pressed her thumb against the embossed court seal, feeling its raised texture like braille spelling out consequences. This was the thing she'd carried in her bag for 14 days, the secret that had made her shoulders tense and her sleep fractured. Today, her father's cruelty had finally given her permission to use it. "This ends," she whispered to the quiet kitchen, her voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated silence. The story behind the folder stretched back 2 weeks, to a Tuesday afternoon that had begun normally enough. Chelsea had called with a request that sounded like charity wrapped in family obligation. Could Leah babysit Emma while Chelsea attended a parent-teacher conference? Of course she could. Family helped family, even when help flowed in only one direction. Chelsea's house in the better suburb felt like a museum of success. Everything matched, everything gleamed, everything served as subtle reminder of how much more Chelsea had achieved. The mortgage was smaller, the neighborhood safer, the refrigerator larger and newer and filled with organic choices instead of generic necessities. Leah had settled Emma in front of a Disney movie and retreated to the living room, where she could keep an eye on the child while reviewing her own insurance paperwork. Numbers required attention, and quiet afternoons were rare in her own smaller, busier world. The laptop on Chelsea's coffee table had awakened by accident, Leah's elbow nudging the trackpad as she reached for her reading glasses. The screen lit up to display a PDF document that had been left open, probably from Chelsea's morning work session. Leah almost closed it immediately. Privacy mattered, even among family. But her grandfather's name caught her eye like a fishhook, bold letters at the top of what appeared to be financial documentation. She froze, her reading glasses halfway to her face, recognition washing over her like cold water. This was a trust document. Her grandfather's trust. The document her parents had always claimed was too complicated for her to understand, better left to people who know about these things. Her own name appeared in the beneficiaries section, Leah Catherine Martinez, 50% remainder interest upon death of trust grantor. The date of her grandfather's death was listed precisely October 15, 2018. 5 years and 2 months ago. 50% meant half of everything. Half of whatever her grandfather had left behind when cancer finally claimed him. Below that, a line item caught her attention like a spotlight: distribution request, October 2023, denied due to insufficient documentation of emergency need. October 2023. The month she'd called her parents, desperate, after someone had broken into her condo while she was at work. Her television was gone, her small jewelry collection disappeared, her sense of safety shattered along with the lock they'd broken. The police report existed somewhere in a filing cabinet, proof of violation and loss. She'd asked her parents for help with a security deposit on a safer apartment. $3,000. Not a fortune, not a lifetime debt, just enough to move somewhere with better locks and security cameras. Her father had listened to her voice shake as she described coming home to chaos, then replied that family money wasn't available for non-emergencies. But here, on Chelsea's coffee table, she saw that same month marked as a denied distribution from a trust that legally belonged half to her. While she'd slept with a chair propped against her front door, Chelsea's family had somehow needed new granite countertops. Leah's hands moved without conscious thought, lifting her phone, opening the camera application, framing the document on the screen. The image captured cleanly her grandfather's name, the trust title, the beneficiary information, the damning line about denied distributions. Evidence that could not be argued with or explained away. She closed the laptop before Emma could finish her movie, before Chelsea could return from the conference, before anyone could catch her. Discovering what had been hidden for 5 years. But the photograph remained in her phone like a smoking gun, proof that family loyalty had been a one-way street built on lies. The next day, she sat in Rebecca Shaw's law office, a small practice squeezed between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. The waiting room smelled like coffee and determination, filled with people who had reached the end of other options. Rebecca emerged from her inner office looking exactly like what Leah needed: professional without being intimidating, competent without being condescending. "I think my family has been stealing from me," Leah had said simply, laying the photograph on Rebecca's desk like evidence in a murder trial. Rebecca studied the image for exactly 5 seconds before looking up with eyes that had seen this story before. "Trust litigation," she said matter-of-factly. "How long has this been going on?" 5 years. Maybe longer. "Family members as trustees?" "My parents." Rebecca nodded as though checking boxes on a mental list. "Beneficiary with legal standing to request accounting. Potential breach of fiduciary duty. This is actionable, Mrs. Martinez. Do you want to proceed?" Leah had expected more questions, more hesitation, more warnings about destroying family relationships. But Rebecca treated theft as theft, regardless of who wore the title of mother or father. "What happens next?" Leah asked. "We petition for emergency relief. Freeze the assets, compel production of records, remove them as trustees if necessary." They've had 5 years to explain themselves. Time's up. The papers had been filed that afternoon, processed through the court system with the efficient brutality of legal machinery. Rebecca had warned her that service would happen during the holidays. Courts didn't pause for Christmas when money was disappearing. Family dinners would become crime scenes. Holiday traditions would be interrupted by process servers. Leah had lived with that knowledge for 14 days, carrying the folder like a loaded gun, waiting for her family to provide sufficient reason to use it. Tonight, watching her grandfather shove her daughter to the floor while everyone else chose silence, that reason had finally arrived. Her phone lit up again with another call from Chelsea, then immediately switched to a text from her mother: "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." But it wasn't getting out of hand. It was getting into hands that understood fiduciary duty and legal standing and the difference between family loyalty and accessory to theft. For the first time in 5 years, it was getting into the right hands. Leah gathered her papers back into their respective places. Pill organizer in the tote pocket, Medicare card in her wallet, SSA letter in the kitchen drawer where important documents lived. The folder went into a new place front and center on her kitchen counter, visible and unashamed. Tomorrow, Rebecca would call with updates. Opposing counsel would be retained. Court dates would be scheduled. The machinery of justice would begin grinding forward with the patient inevitability of law. Tonight, Leah checked the ice pack on Maisie's knee and adjusted the blankets around her sleeping daughter. The bruise would heal. The humiliation would fade. But the precedent had been set: no one would lay hands on this child again, and no one would steal their future while smiling at Christmas dinner. Outside, snow continued to fall on a suburb where some families exchanged gifts and others exchanged lawsuits. Where some children woke up to stockings filled with toys. And others woke up with bruised knees and the knowledge that their mothers would fight armies to protect them. The folder in Leah's bag hadn't just contained legal documents. It had contained 5 years of denied help, decades of accumulated slights. And the blueprint for war that should have started the day her grandfather's will was read. But wars needed the right moment to begin. And watching her father's hand strike her daughter had provided that moment with crystalline clarity. The court papers were filed. The battle lines were drawn. And for the first time in 62 years, Leah Martinez had chosen to fight instead of absorb the blow. The morning after Christmas arrived gray and unforgiving, the kind of December day that made Chicago suburbs look like abandoned movie sets. Leah woke to the sound of Maisie moving carefully in the next room, the soft shuffle of someone learning to navigate with an injured knee. She lay in bed for an extra moment, listening to the familiar sounds of their small world: the heating unit's gentle rumble, the coffee maker's automatic brewing cycle, the distant hum of early commuters starting another day. But today felt different. Today, the legal machinery she'd set in motion would begin grinding forward with the patient inevitability of justice served cold. Leah found Maisie at their kitchen table, eating cereal with the focused concentration of a child trying to make normal activities feel normal again. The bruise on her knee had deepened overnight to purple-black, spreading like spilled ink across pale skin. Maisie had positioned her leg carefully to avoid pressure against the table's edge, the small adjustment speaking volumes about how much it still hurt. "Morning, baby," Leah said softly, settling into the chair across from her daughter. "How's the knee feeling?" "Better," Maisie replied automatically, though she winced slightly when shifting position. "It only hurts when I move wrong." Leah spread her own modest breakfast across the table: coffee that was stronger than usual, toast with generic jam. The pile of bills and paperwork that had accumulated on the counter. Among the familiar monthly statements: electric company, cable provider, car insurance, sat a Medicare EOB that still made her stomach tighten. She unfolded the document carefully, studying numbers that never quite added up the way they should. Patient responsibility $347.82. For services she couldn't quite remember authorizing, at a facility she'd visited once for a routine procedure that should have been covered completely. The explanation codes were bureaucratic hieroglyphics, referring to policy subsections and coverage limitations that required advanced degrees to decode. Her phone, silent since she'd turned it face down the night before, suddenly buzzed against the table like an angry insect. A text from Rebecca Shaw appeared on the screen: "Open their response. Call me when you hit page 2. Leah's coffee grew cold as she opened the email attachment that would show her exactly who her family really was. The legal response came from Janine Keller and Associates, a firm whose letterhead exuded expensive confidence. The first page contained standard legal language: acknowledgement of service, representation confirmation, preliminary objections to emergency relief. Professional, expected, unremarkable. But page 2 made her hands shake. The document accused her of harassment and bad faith litigation. It claimed she had no legitimate standing to challenge trust administration. It described her petition as a transparent attempt to extort family members during the holiday season. Each phrase was crafted to wound, legal precision deployed like surgical strikes against her character. But the paragraph that made her vision tunnel with rage was buried in the middle of the page. Bolded like a slogan, petitioner's claim to trust benefits is additionally questionable given serious doubts about her status as legitimate family member. Blood relationship to trust grantor remains unconfirmed, rendering any claimed inheritance rights potentially invalid. Real grandchildren should not be forced to subsidize false family claims. Real grandchildren. The same phrase her father had used while shoving Maisie to the floor. Now it appeared in legal documents, dressed up in formal language but carrying the same poison. Leah set the papers down carefully, her hands trembling not with fear, but with the kind of clean anger that cut through confusion and made everything crystal clear. She called Rebecca immediately. "You read page 2, Rebecca said without preamble. "They're saying I'm not." Leah's voice caught. "They're questioning whether I'm his granddaughter." "They're throwing sand," Rebecca replied calmly. "It's what people do when they have weak legal positions. Don't take the bait." "But what if, Mrs. Martinez?" Rebecca's voice carried the authority of someone who'd fought these battles before. "You were raised in that house. Your name is on the trust. You have legal standing regardless of biology. This is about money they've already spent, not about who your parents are." After ending the call, Leah sat in her quiet kitchen and let the implications settle like sediment in still water. For 40 years, she'd felt like an outsider in her own family. Blamed herself for never quite fitting, accepted that love came with conditions she couldn't meet. Now those whispered doubts had become courtroom weapons. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her father, arriving like a final insult. "Tell the judge why you should get my father's inheritance if you're not even mine." Leah stared at the message until the words blurred. Then something shifted inside her, a gear clicking into place after years of grinding against resistance. She looked at Maisie, who was reading a book while carefully avoiding putting weight on her injured leg, and whispered to the morning air, "He doesn't get to write our story anymore." That afternoon brought the first concrete evidence of what 5 years of trust administration had actually accomplished. Rebecca had obtained preliminary financial records through emergency court order, and they painted a picture that was both shocking and completely unsurprising. Leah sat across from Rebecca's desk in the small office, reading numbers that transformed family relationships into simple theft. Trust principal at her grandfather's death $480,000. Intended distribution per trust terms $240,000 to Leah, $240,000 to Chelsea upon reaching specific milestones. Current trust balance $38,000. Where did it go? Leah asked, though she already knew the answer would hurt. Rebecca slid another document across the desk. Distribution history. Every withdrawal, every approval, every trustee decision for the past 5 years. The list read like a catalog of comfortable living subsidized by stolen inheritance, down payment assistance for Chelsea's house, vehicle purchases, family emergency support, educational expenses, home improvement loans. Categories that sounded noble and abstract but felt like betrayal when funded with money that should have helped Leah move to a safer apartment. One line item made her vision blur with fury: emergency family support, October 2023, $15,000. The same month her own emergency request had been denied. While she'd slept with a chair against her broken door, Chelsea's family had received $15,000 from a trust that was legally half Leah's. "This is theft," she said quietly. "Yes," Rebecca confirmed without hesitation. "Breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, failure to account to beneficiaries. Your grandfather left you $240,000. They gave you excuses." That evening, Leah's small condo felt like a fortress under siege. The legal battle was just beginning, but already the emotional warfare had escalated beyond anything she'd experienced. Her phone carried a steady stream of family commentary, each message designed to make her doubt her own perceptions. A cousin she barely spoke to apologized to your father. "This is embarrassing for everyone." Her aunt, who had witnessed decades of slights, "You've always been dramatic. Family should stick together." Chelsea's husband, suddenly compelled to share his legal expertise, "Courts don't like family disputes. You should settle this privately." Each message carried the same underlying assumption that her pain mattered less than their comfort. That her legal rights were negotiable in ways theirs would never be. But none of them asked about Maisie's knee. None inquired whether a 9-year-old was sleeping well after being assaulted by her grandfather. The silence around her daughter's injury was its own kind of evidence. Leah cooked dinner with methodical precision, focusing on the simple task of heating soup and cutting sandwiches into triangles. Maisie helped from her chair, passing napkins and arranging crackers with the serious attention children brought to being useful. Their small kitchen filled with comfortable sounds: simmering broth, clinking spoons, the soft conversation of people who had learned to find peace in simple routines. Are we going back there? Maisie asked suddenly, not looking up from her soup. Where, baby? Grandpa's house. For New Year's or birthdays or anything. Leah set down her spoon and looked directly at her daughter. Maisie's dark eyes held an expression far too serious for 9 years. Old, the look of someone who had learned that safety wasn't guaranteed, that belonging could be revoked without warning. No, Leah said simply. We're not going back. Good, Maisie replied, returning to her soup with visible relief. That night, after Maisie fell asleep with an ice pack positioned carefully against her knee, Leah sat at her kitchen table and composed the hardest text message she'd ever written. Not to her family, they'd made their positions clear. But to herself, typed into her phone's notes app like a contract. I will not apologize for protecting my child. I will not shrink to make others comfortable. I will not accept crumbs from a table that was set with my inheritance. This stops here. She read the words 3 times, then saved them in a file labeled, Reminders, for the dark days that were certainly coming. Outside her window, Christmas lights still twinkled in neighbors' houses, warm, inviting, normal. But inside their small condo, something had shifted permanently. The dynamic that had governed 62 years of family relationships had been shattered by legal documents and a 9-year-old's bruised knee. Tomorrow would bring more court filings, more family outrage, more opportunities for her relatives to choose sides in a war they'd been quietly waging for decades. But tonight, Leah Martinez sat in her own kitchen, surrounded by her own things. Protecting her own child, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the solid ground of knowing she was right. The trust documents weren't just about money. They were about whether her grandfather's love had been real, whether her place in the family was legal fact or charitable fiction. Whether her daughter would inherit dignity or doubt. The court would decide the money. But Leah had already decided the more important question. She was done begging for seats at tables where she'd always belonged. From now on, she'd build her own table smaller. Maybe, but set with honesty and respect and the absolute certainty that every person who sat there was wanted, welcomed, and worthy of protection. The Cook County Courthouse rose from downtown Chicago's morning shadows like a monument to final answers. Leah stood on the steps at 8:30 a.m., clutching a folder that contained 5 years of accumulated evidence. Watching her breath create small clouds in the January air. Her navy blazer, purchased specifically for this day, felt like armor against more than just the cold. Rebecca Shaw approached from the street, her briefcase moving with the efficient rhythm of someone who fought these battles professionally. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, her expression carrying the calm confidence of a lawyer who understood exactly how justice worked when emotion was removed from the equation. Ready? Rebecca asked simply. Leah nodded, though her stomach felt like it was trying to digest glass shards. What happens if? Don't, Rebecca cut her off gently. Today we present facts. Facts don't need backup plans. The courthouse corridors smelled like floor wax and broken dreams, filled with people carrying folders like Leah's evidence of families destroyed by money, marriages dissolved by deception. Children caught between parents who had forgotten how to be adults. Leah felt simultaneously unique and utterly ordinary, another story in a building that collected them like trading cards. Courtroom 3B was smaller than television had taught her to expect. No jury box, no gallery filled with spectators. Just a judge's bench, 2 attorney tables, and enough space for justice to be administered with bureaucratic efficiency. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh clarity that made lies harder to maintain. Leah sat in the front row behind Rebecca's table, her hands clasped tightly enough to leave marks. In her purse, she carried the things that had become talismans of her new independence: her Medicare card, her pill organizer, her phone with the photograph that had started this war. But today, those personal artifacts felt less important than the legal documents Rebecca was arranging with military precision. At 9 a.m. exactly, the opposing side entered. Janine Keller moved like someone accustomed to winning before the fight began. Her suit was expensive without being flashy, her briefcase leather where Rebecca's was practical canvas, her smile bright enough to power small appliances. She was followed by a junior associate carrying additional files, then by Leah's parents. Leah's father wore his courtroom face, the same expression he'd used to dominate dinner tables and family meetings. Cold authority wrapped in respectful deference to the judge. His gray suit fit perfectly, his silver hair was combed with precision, his hands remained steady as he took his seat behind Keller's table. Leah's mother looked smaller than usual, her shoulders curved inward, her eyes focused on her hands rather than the courtroom around her. She wore the black dress reserved for funerals and formal apologies, her wedding ring catching fluorescent light as she twisted it nervously around her finger. Neither parent looked at Leah. Neither acknowledged her presence. They sat 3 rows apart but could have been on different planets, the distance measured not in feet but in decades of accumulated damage. Judge Sarah Chen entered at 9:15, her black robes settling around her like gathered authority. She was younger than Leah had expected, maybe 50, with dark hair. Pulled back and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough family dysfunction to last several lifetimes. Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who dispensed justice in measured doses. Emergency motion for preservation of assets and compelled accounting, she announced, settling behind her bench like a referee. Calling a fight that had been building for years. Ms. Shaw, you filed the petition. Rebecca stood with fluid grace, her voice carrying across the courtroom without strain. Your Honor, this case involves a simple question: did trustees of a family trust fulfill their fiduciary duties to beneficiaries? Or did they treat trust assets as personal funding for one family branch while excluding another? She opened her folder and began reading numbers with the mechanical precision of an accountant trust. Principal at death, intended distributions, current balance. Mathematics transformed family relationships into stark equations that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Trust documents specified equal distribution to granddaughters upon death of grantor. One granddaughter received substantial ongoing support. The other was told repeatedly that funds were unavailable for documented emergencies. We request immediate asset preservation and full accounting. Keller's response came wrapped in silk and sympathy. She spoke of complex family dynamics and difficult decisions made by trustees who were only trying to do their best in challenging circumstances. Her voice carried practiced warmth, the tone of someone explaining complicated truths to people who wouldn't understand the bigger picture. The petitioner has always been welcome in this family, Keller continued smoothly. The trustees' decisions were based on legitimate concerns about the stability and appropriateness of various distribution requests. Trust administration requires careful consideration of long-term consequences. She paused, then delivered the poison with surgical precision. Additionally, Your Honor, there remain substantial questions about the petitioner's biological relationship to the trust grantor. Given the uncertainty about her actual status as a family member, extraordinary caution in distribution decisions was not only appropriate but necessary. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Leah felt her cheeks burn as the implication hung in the air she might be an illegitimate child seeking inheritance she had never legitimately deserved. The kind of legal argument that dressed family cruelty in respectable clothing. Rebecca stood immediately, her voice cutting through Keller's attempted narrative like a scalpel through flesh. Your Honor, biology is irrelevant to this proceeding. The trust documents name Leah Martinez as beneficiary. Trustees don't get to conduct genetic testing to override legal documents. Either she's named in the trust or she isn't. The documents are unambiguous. She pulled out the trust papers and read directly from the beneficiary section. Leah Catherine Martinez. Granddaughter, 50% remainder interest upon death of grantor. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Blood tests aren't required to enforce legal contracts. Judge Chen studied the documents silently, her expression revealing nothing. The courtroom waited in suspended tension while she reviewed beneficiary language, distribution requirements, and trustee obligations. Finally, she looked up. I'm granting the emergency motion, she said simply. All trust assets are frozen effective immediately. Trustees are ordered to produce complete financial records within 14 days every statement, every distribution, every approval or denial. Additionally, petitioner's biological status is irrelevant to her legal standing under this trust. The document names her as beneficiary. That's sufficient. The gavel's bang echoed like a gunshot in the small courtroom. Leah felt her body sag with relief she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Beside her, Rebecca gathered papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose facts had proven stronger than opposing emotions. But across the courtroom, Leah's father was standing, his face flushed with anger that courtroom decorum couldn't completely suppress. He whispered something harsh to Keller, who nodded and began gathering her own materials with considerably less satisfaction. As people filed out of the courtroom, Leah found herself walking parallel to her parents in the corridor, close enough to hear their voices, but separated by legal battle lines that had been drawn permanently. Her father turned toward her suddenly, his pale blue eyes carrying fury barely contained by public setting. He stepped close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that had intimidated her throughout childhood. "You're not taking anything from this family," he hissed, his voice low enough to avoid attracting courthouse security, but clear enough to carry complete threat. Leah felt her breath catch, not with fear, but with the sudden realization that she wasn't afraid anymore. Standing in this courthouse corridor, surrounded by the machinery of justice that had just ruled in her favor, she felt something shift in her chest, like a gear clicking into proper alignment. "You already took it," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her father's mouth opened, then closed without sound. For 62 years, he had been the final authority on what she deserved, what she could expect, where she belonged. Now a judge had ruled that his opinions were irrelevant to legal fact. The dynamic that had governed their entire relationship had been overturned by paperwork and precedent. Leah walked away without waiting for his response, following Rebecca toward the courthouse exit, where January wind would feel like freedom instead of punishment. On the steps outside, Rebecca reviewed what happened. Next, opposing counsel would file appeals, produce the required records, attempt to negotiate settlements that preserved their client's dignity. The legal process would grind forward with patient inevitability, but today's ruling meant the outcome was no longer in doubt. "They'll offer to settle," Rebecca predicted. "Probably quickly, once they see what we'll find in those records." But as Leah climbed into her 10-year-old sedan for the drive home, she thought about something more important than money. In that courtroom, she had watched her father try to use the same techniques that had worked for decades: intimidation, dismissal, the suggestion that her feelings weren't quite as valid as other people's. For the first time in her life, those techniques had been completely powerless. A judge had looked at their family dynamics and ruled them legally irrelevant. Leah's biological status, her father's opinions, her mother's careful silences, none of it mattered compared to words written on legal documents and signed by her grandfather before cancer stole his voice forever. That evening, Leah sat at her kitchen table with mail that had accumulated during the courthouse day. Bills still needed paying, Medicare EOBs still required decoding. Life still demanded the small attentions that kept ordinary existence running smoothly. But everything felt different now, like she was performing familiar tasks while wearing new eyes. Maisie worked on homework at the other end of the table, her injured knee elevated on a chair pillow, her math problems requiring the kind of focused concentration that made her tongue stick out slightly. The bruise was already beginning to fade around the edges, purple, giving way to green and yellow as her body healed itself with the resilient efficiency of childhood. "How was your important meeting?" Maisie asked without looking up from her division problems. "Good," Leah replied. "The judge said we were right." "About what?" "About fairness. About people keeping promises. About not letting anyone hurt you." Maisie nodded seriously, as though judges' ruling on fairness was exactly what she'd expected from important meetings. Then she returned to her homework while Leah sorted through the mail that would determine whether they could afford groceries this week. But tonight, even the bills felt different. They weren't evidence of failure or proof of inadequacy. They were just bills, problems with solutions, numbers that could be managed, temporary obstacles instead of permanent judgments on her worth. For the first time in 5 years, Leah Martinez was not asking her family for permission to exist. She was demanding what the law said belonged to her, enforcing contracts that had been signed by someone who had loved her enough to protect her future even after death. The courthouse had proven something important: her grandfather's words carried more legal weight than her father's opinions. And tomorrow, she would begin discovering exactly what those words were worth. The trust records arrived in 3 boxes, delivered by courier like evidence in a murder trial. Leah signed for them at her front door, the delivery man's clipboard feeling heavier than the cardboard containers he left stacked in her hallway. Each box bore official court seals and law firm labels that transformed family secrets into discoverable evidence. For 2 hours, she left them untouched, moving around the boxes as though they were sleeping explosives. Maisie asked questions that Leah answered with half attention. Important papers, baby. Nothing for you to worry about. But the lie felt thin even to her own ears. These papers would determine whether they worried about rent or security deposits, whether Maisie's future included college funds or student loans. Finally, after Maisie settled into afternoon homework and cartoons, Leah carried the first box to her kitchen table. The dining room would have provided more space, but kitchens felt safer for devastating truths. Kitchens were places where problems got solved with practical solutions, where tears could be wiped away with dish towels, where coffee could provide courage when courage ran thin. The documents inside were organized chronologically, 5 years of trust administration laid out like archaeological layers. Bank statements, distribution requests, trustee approvals, beneficiary correspondence, each page representing a decision that had shaped the financial landscape of her family's life. Leah spread the papers across her table beside current bills that demanded immediate attention. Property tax notice $1,847. Due by January 31st, heating bill $234, higher than usual because of December's brutal cold. Medicare supplement premium $127 monthly, automatically deducted from her Social Security. The arithmetic of survival at 62, when every dollar had to be allocated before it arrived. But the trust documents told a different story, one where money flowed like water for purposes that weren't survival at all. Chelsea's requests appeared with predictable regularity: down payment, assistance for the house in the better neighborhood $35,000, approved immediately; vehicle purchase support when her lease expired $18,000. Granted within 2 weeks; educational enrichment, funds for Emma's private school tuition $12,000 annually, automatically renewed. Each approval bore their mother's signature alongside their father's, both trustees agreeing that Chelsea's requests constituted appropriate trust distributions. The legal language was formal: prudent investment in beneficiaries' stability, and family advancement purposes, but the pattern was unmistakable. One granddaughter received immediate approval for wants while the other was denied funding for needs. The October 2023 section made Leah's hands shake with recognition. Her own letter was there, typed carefully on her computer and printed on paper that now seemed pathetically inadequate. Following a break-in at my residence, I am requesting emergency assistance with security deposit for safer housing. Police report attached. Amount needed $3,000. Below her request, her father's handwriting appeared in red ink like judgment: insufficient documentation of genuine emergency. Denied pending further information. But 3 pages later, the same month showed a distribution to Chelsea for $15,000, categorized as family support during transition period. The trustee notes indicated no documentation required, no questions asked, no pending information needed. Just immediate approval for a sum that was 5 times what Leah had desperately requested. Leah set the papers down carefully, her vision blurring not with tears but with the kind of clean rage that made everything crystalline. For 5 years, she had blamed herself for not asking correctly, not explaining clearly enough, not deserving help during emergencies that kept her awake with anxiety. Now she understood that the problem hadn't been her requests. It had been her requesting. Her phone rang with Rebecca's number. "Have you started reviewing the records?" "Some of them," Leah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "What year are you in?" 2023. October. A pause. "The month you needed help with the apartment?" "Yes. And what do you see?" "That they gave Chelsea $15,000 while telling me $3,000 was too much for an emergency." "Document everything," Rebecca said quietly. "Dates, amounts, justifications. We're building a timeline that shows preferential treatment. This isn't family dynamics, it's breach of fiduciary duty." That evening, while Maisie took her bath with the door open so she could call for help avoiding pressure on her healing knee, Leah continued reading through evidence that transformed her family's dynamics into legal violations. The pattern was consistent across 5 years. Chelsea's requests were investments in family stability, Leah's were scrutinized as potential frivolous spending. 2019 Chelsea received approval for home improvement loans that increased property values. Leah was denied assistance with medical bills that threatened her credit rating. 2020 Chelsea's family received educational support for Emma's private school tuition. Leah's request for help during unemployment was rejected as temporary hardship not requiring trust intervention. 2021 Chelsea obtained emergency family support for vacation expenses after a difficult year. Leah's car repair funding was denied because vehicle maintenance should be planned expenses. Each denial contained careful legal language about prudent trust administration and long-term beneficiary welfare. But the approvals used different standards, different criteria, different definitions of what constituted appropriate family support. The most damaging evidence appeared in internal emails between her parents, printed as part of the required discovery. Her mother had written to her father, "Leah's requests are becoming more frequent. Should we establish some kind of policy about limitations?" Her father's response was brief and devastating: "She needs to learn that trust money isn't welfare." Real family members manage their own lives. Real family members. The same phrase that had appeared in legal filings, in courtroom arguments, and now in private correspondence between trustees who were supposed to treat beneficiaries equally under law. Evidence that biology had always been the determining factor, regardless of what trust documents actually required. Leah printed copies of the most damaging pages, organizing them chronologically in a folder that would destroy her family while establishing her legal rights. Justice and relationships rarely aligned, but tonight she chose justice. With the clarity of someone who had finally stopped trying to earn what was already hers. The second box contained correspondence that was somehow worse than financial records. Letters she had written over 5 years, requesting help during genuine emergencies. Explaining circumstances that had felt shameful to share but necessary to document. Each letter revealed someone who still believed family would help if she just explained correctly, asked politely enough, demonstrated sufficient need. Reading her own words from 2 years ago was like watching someone else's desperation. "I know the trust is meant for important purposes. But my heating bill has reached the point where I'm choosing between medication copays and staying warm. If there's any way the trust could help with the past due amount $847, I would be grateful for consideration during this difficult winter." Her father's response had been swift and brutal: "Trust funds are not intended to subsidize poor financial planning. Contact social services if you need assistance with basic utilities." But that same month, Chelsea had received approval for $8,000 in family emergency support. Because her dishwasher had broken and required immediate replacement. The trustee notes indicated the disbursement was necessary to maintain family property values and prevent larger repair costs. A dishwasher versus heating bills. Property values versus prescription medications. Different standards for different granddaughters, documented in language that would be devastating in courtroom testimony. Leah's phone buzzed with a text from her aunt, her mother's sister, who had witnessed decades of family dynamics. But never intervened. "I heard about the court case. Can't you work this out privately? Family shouldn't air dirty laundry in public." But this wasn't dirty laundry. This was documented theft, preferential treatment disguised as trust administration. 5 years of legal violations that had cost Leah her financial security while enhancing Chelsea's comfortable lifestyle. She typed a brief response: "Ask them about my heating bill versus Chelsea's dishwasher," then immediately deleted it. Family members who had chosen silence during years of obvious favoritism didn't deserve explanations now that documentation proved their complicity. The third box contained the most recent records, including distributions made after her grandfather's funeral money disbursed while Leah was still processing grief. Still believing that family bonds meant something beyond legal obligations. Chelsea had received $50,000 within 6 months of the funeral, categorized as inheritance advancement to support family stability during transition period. Leah had received a sympathy card and advice about managing expectations during difficult times. The arithmetic was devastating. Over 5 years, Chelsea's family had received approximately $180,000 in trust distributions for purposes ranging from genuine need to obvious convenience. Leah had received $0, despite documented emergencies that had threatened her housing, her health, her basic security. Trust principal had decreased from $480,000 to $38,000, not through investment losses or administrative fees, but through systematic favoritism that treated family resources as rewards for being the right kind of granddaughter. That night, Leah sat at her kitchen table surrounded by evidence that would end her family relationships while securing her daughter's future. The boxes were empty now, their contents organized into folders that told the story of how love could be disguised as legal administration, how theft could be dressed up as family values. Outside her window, January wind rattled glass that needed replacing, in a condo that needed improvements. She couldn't afford, heated by a system that threatened to fail every winter when bills peaked beyond her budget. But inside, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: the solid certainty of being right. The documents proved what she had always suspected but never dared voice. Her family's treatment of her hadn't been about her failures or inadequacies or inability to manage money properly. It had been about systematic exclusion disguised as legal propriety, theft, committed by people who had convinced themselves they were protecting family resources from someone who didn't quite count as real family. Tomorrow, Rebecca would review these materials and transform them into legal arguments that courts would find compelling. Judges understood fiduciary duty, preferential treatment, and the difference between family dynamics and financial crimes. But tonight, surrounded by evidence of 5 years of betrayal, Leah Martinez felt something: unexpected relief. Not happiness, the truth was too devastating for celebration. But relief that she wasn't crazy, wasn't inadequate, hadn't failed some test of family worthiness that others had passed. She had been systematically excluded from benefits that were legally hers. And now she had proof that would make the exclusion stop, regardless of what it cost in terms of family relationships that had never been genuine anyway. The trust documents hadn't just revealed financial crimes. They had revealed the arithmetic of conditional love, where some grandchildren counted as investments while others were treated as risks. Math that would be corrected by courtrooms that understood numbers better than emotions. 3 weeks after the emergency hearing, Leah stood in her bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., holding a cotton swab like a verdict waiting to happen. The paternity testing kit had arrived by priority mail. No return address, just her name printed in block letters that suggested official business rather than family cruelty. But she knew who had sent it. The instructions were clinically simple: swab the inside of your cheek, seal the sample in the provided container, return in the prepaid envelope. Results would be available through a secure online portal within 5 business days. Science would settle what family had used as a weapon for 40 years. Leah scraped the swab against her cheek with mechanical precision, watching her own eyes in the mirror for signs of the emotion she wasn't allowing herself to feel. The cotton came away slightly damp, carrying cells that would either vindicate decades of doubt or confirm that her place in the family had been legitimate all along. She sealed the tube without ceremony, labeled it with her name and case number, and slipped it into the return envelope like depositing evidence in a crime lab. Because that's what this was: evidence that would prove or disprove the biological basis for 62 years of emotional exile. At the kitchen table, Maisie ate breakfast with the focused concentration of a child who had learned to read adult tensions without asking direct questions. Her injured knee was healing well, the bruise faded to yellow-green edges around pink skin that was finally returning to normal. She wore loose jeans that didn't press against the sensitive area, and her movements had regained most of their natural fluidity. "I have to mail something important," Leah announced, trying to keep her voice level. "Want to walk to the post office with me?" "Sure," Maisie replied, though her dark eyes held the careful attention of someone monitoring for signs of adult distress. "Is it about the papers and the lawyers?" "Yes, baby. Just more paperwork that needs to be handled." The morning was brutally cold, typical January weather that made Chicago suburbs feel like punishment for something residents couldn't remember doing wrong. They walked carefully on sidewalks where ice persisted despite yesterday's salt treatments, Maisie staying close enough to grab Leah's arm if her knee betrayed her balance. The post office was warm and bureaucratically comforting, filled with the ordinary business of people mailing ordinary things to ordinary destinations. Leah handed the envelope to the clerk with hands that remained steadier than she'd expected. Watching it disappear into a bin that would carry her genetic material to a laboratory where strangers would determine whether she had the right to fight for her inheritance. Priority mail? The clerk asked. Regular is fine, Leah replied. Some answers didn't need to arrive quickly. That afternoon brought a call from Rebecca with updates that made the paternity test feel even more surreal. Opposing counsel had filed motions requesting postponement pending resolution of biological standing questions. They wanted the entire case delayed until Leah could prove she was actually related to the man whose trust she was trying to enforce. Can they do that? Leah asked. They can try, Rebecca replied. But Judge Chen was pretty clear about biological status being irrelevant to legal standing. The trust names Leah Martinez as beneficiary. Unless they want to argue that you're not actually Leah Martinez, biology doesn't matter. But it mattered to Leah in ways that had nothing to do with legal standing. For 62 years, she had felt like an outsider in her own family. Blamed herself for never quite fitting the mold that seemed natural to Chelsea, accepted that love came with conditions she couldn't identify or meet. If the test proved she wasn't biologically related to her supposed father, it would explain everything. If it proved she was his daughter, it would make the decades of emotional distance even more devastating. The waiting was brutal. 5 business days stretched like months, filled with ordinary activities that felt suspended in time. Leah went to work at the medical office where she processed insurance claims, organized patient files, and answered phones with professional cheerfulness that felt like acting. She picked Maisie up from school, helped with homework, made dinners that neither of them had much appetite for, and went through the motions of normal life while genetic analysis determined her family's future. Her phone carried a steady stream of family commentary, though none of them mentioned the paternity test directly. Her cousin called with advice about keeping family business private. Her aunt sent texts about the importance of working things out without lawyers. Chelsea posted social media photos of her picture-perfect life with captions about family loyalty that felt like indirect attacks. But none of them asked about Maisie's knee. None inquired about whether Leah was sleeping well or managing the stress of legal battles. The silence around her actual welfare was its own kind of evidence about what they considered important. Wednesday evening, while Maisie worked on a school project about family trees that felt ironically appropriate, Leah's phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line was clinical and final, paternity test results case PT 202400156. She stared at the notification for a full minute before opening it. Her heart hammering against her ribs with the irregular rhythm of someone about to learn whether their entire life story was true or false. The report was brief and unambiguous, probability of paternity 99.7%. This result indicates that the tested man is the biological father of the tested woman with greater than 99% certainty. Leah read the sentence 3 times before its meaning penetrated completely. She was his daughter. Biologically, unambiguously, scientifically confirmed. The man who had spent 40 years treating her like a question mark was actually her father. Which meant that 40 years of emotional exile had been choice rather than biological uncertainty. She forwarded the results to Rebecca immediately, then sat in her quiet kitchen and let the implications settle like sediment in still water. The test hadn't freed her from family doubt, it had proven that family doubt had been weaponized. Deliberately, used to justify treatment that had no basis in biological reality. Her father had known or suspected the truth for decades, but had chosen to use uncertainty as permission to treat his own daughter as a conditional family member. Her mother had participated in the cruelty despite knowing it was unfounded. They had let Leah doubt her own place in the family for 62 years because doubt served their purposes better than acceptance. Her phone rang with Rebecca's number. "I assume you've seen the results." "Yes. How are you feeling?" Leah considered the question carefully. "I thought I'd be relieved if it proved I was his daughter. But I'm not. I'm furious. Because now you know the exclusion was intentional? Because now I know they could have ended this anytime. They could have done this test years ago, decades ago. They preferred keeping me uncertain because uncertainty gave them control." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell them you have the results?" "I'm going to forward them the report with no message." Let them draw their own conclusions. That evening, after Maisie was asleep, Leah sat at her computer and composed the most important email she'd ever written. No explanation, no commentary, no emotional appeals. Just the laboratory report attached to a message that contained her father's email address and nothing else. She pressed send and immediately blocked both parents' phone numbers. Whatever conversations needed to happen could go through lawyers now. The family relationship that had been poisoned by 40 years of deliberate doubt was officially over. The response came 3 hours later, not from her father but from her mother, calling from a number Leah didn't recognize. The voicemail was barely coherent sobbing mixed with words about mistakes and misunderstandings and wanting to fix things that had gotten out of hand. But Leah didn't return the call. Some things were too broken to repair, and some people forfeited the right to explanations when they spent decades using cruelty disguised as uncertainty. Instead, she opened her laptop and began documenting everything she could remember about 40 years of being treated as a conditional family member. Dates, incidents, conversations, patterns of exclusion that had shaped her understanding of her own worth. Evidence that biology had never been the real issue, control had been the real issue, and doubt had been the weapon of choice. The paternity test had proven she belonged in the family by blood. But more importantly, it had proven that her family had never wanted her to belong, regardless of biology. The legal battle was about money, but the emotional damage was about something much more fundamental. The systematic destruction of a child's sense of worth by people who were supposed to protect it. Tomorrow, Rebecca would file the test results with the court, eliminating any legal questions about Leah's standing to challenge the trust administration. Opposing counsel would be forced to find new arguments for why systematic preferential treatment had been appropriate. Family management rather than financial abuse. But tonight, Leah Martinez sat in her small kitchen and felt something she hadn't expected: freedom. Not from family. She'd been functionally exiled from family for decades. Freedom from doubt about her own perceptions, her own worth, her own right to demand fair treatment from people who shared her DNA. The test had proven she was their daughter and granddaughter by blood. Her grandfather's trust was her inheritance by law. And no amount of family manipulation could change those facts anymore. For the first time in 40 years, biology was on her side instead of being used against her. And that made all the difference in a battle where she'd been fighting uphill for so long she'd forgotten what level ground felt like. The settlement offer arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt too ordinary for the seismic shift it represented. Rebecca's email was brief and professional: "They want to meet. Full payment plus costs and attorney's fees. Are you interested in resolution?" Leah read the message 3 times before its meaning penetrated completely. After 5 months of legal warfare, character assassination, and systematic document production that had revealed decades of financial favoritism, her family was ready to surrender unconditionally. The number was staggering: $368,000. Her original inheritance, plus interest, penalties for breach of fiduciary duty, and compensation for legal fees that had accumulated like storm damage. More money than she'd ever imagined having, delivered with the kind of judicial efficiency that transformed family dynamics into mathematical equations. But victory felt less satisfying than she'd expected. The money would solve immediate problems: mortgage worries, Medicare gaps, Maisie's college fund, but it couldn't repair the deeper damage of 40 years spent believing she wasn't quite good enough to deserve equal treatment. Leah was reviewing the settlement details when her doorbell rang at 3 p.m., the sound cutting through afternoon quiet like an emergency signal. Through the peephole, she saw her mother standing alone on the small front porch, hands clasped in front of her like someone asking permission to exist. She opened the door only a crack, cold February air slipping inside along with the scent of snow that hadn't quite decided to fall. Her mother looked smaller than usual, her coat hanging loose on shoulders that seemed to have lost substance during the months of legal battles. "Leah," her mother said softly, the name carrying 40 years of complicated history. "Please, I need to talk to you. We're in the middle of settlement negotiations. Everything should go through the lawyers. Not about the money. About everything else. About why this happened. About why your father." Her voice broke slightly. "About why we let it happen." Against her better judgment, Leah opened the door wider. Her mother stepped inside carefully, as though entering sacred space where sudden movements might cause additional damage. The hallway felt too small for the weight of whatever conversation was about to unfold. They sat in the living room where Maisie had healed from bruises that were now just memories. Where legal documents had been spread across coffee tables like evidence in a trial that had finally reached its verdict. Her mother perched on the edge of the couch as though ready to flee at any moment. "Your father asked me to come," she began, then immediately shook her head. "No, that's not true. I asked him to let me come. I needed to tell you something I should have said 40 years ago." Leah remained silent, her hands folded in her lap with the patient attention of someone who had learned that some truths required complete stillness to emerge. "Before you were born," her mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had an affair. Just once. A mistake that I thought I'd buried so deep it would never matter again." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of their shared history. Leah felt her breathing shift slightly but kept her expression neutral, waiting for the rest of a confession that was obviously incomplete. "Your father found out. Or suspected. I was never sure which was worse, him knowing for certain or spending decades wondering whether he knew." Her mother's hands twisted in her lap like birds trying to escape. "When you were born, he looked for signs that you weren't his. Your hair color, your eyes, the way you moved. Everything became evidence of betrayal." Leah thought about 40 years of feeling like she was failing tests. She couldn't identify, being judged by standards that were never explained, walking on ground that shifted beneath her feet without warning. Now the randomness had a pattern, the criticism had a source. "So you both decided I was guilty of your mistake," Leah said quietly. "We decided." Her mother paused, searching for words that might make decades of cruelty sound reasonable. "We decided it was easier to treat you like a question mark than to deal with the truth. I was too ashamed to insist on your rights. He was too angry to acknowledge them." The confession continued like a dam breaking under pressure that had built for decades. Her mother described family meetings where Leah's treatment was discussed like policy decisions. Christmas dinners where seating arrangements were designed to reinforce her conditional status. Trust decisions where her requests were automatically viewed through the lens of genetic uncertainty. Every time you asked for help, he saw someone who might not really be family asking for money that should go to his real granddaughter. Every time I could have intervened, I chose silence because speaking up would mean admitting what I'd done. Leah felt something shifting in her chest, not forgiveness but understanding of the mechanism that had shaped her entire life. Her parents hadn't been randomly cruel or accidentally unfair. They had been systematically punishing a child for an adult's infidelity, using uncertainty as permission to treat her as a permanent outsider. "The paternity test," her mother said, "proved what I'd always known but been too afraid to confirm. You were his daughter. You were always his daughter. We destroyed your childhood over doubt that I could have resolved with science anytime in the past 40 years. But you didn't," Leah replied, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated understanding. "Because doubt served your purposes. Uncertainty gave you permission to treat me as less than family while maintaining plausible deniability." Her mother's face crumpled with recognition. Yes. The silence that followed felt like the space between lightning and thunder, pregnant with consequences that were still rippling outward from decades-old decisions. Leah thought about Maisie's bruised knee, about Christmas dinner. Violence that had shocked no one enough to intervene, about the generational pattern of conditional love that had been passed down like genetic inheritance. "Why are you telling me this now?" Leah asked. "Because the settlement is going to be finalized next week. Because after that, we'll probably never speak again. Because I wanted you to know that none of it was your fault." Her mother's voice grew stronger, as though confessing the truth had given her access to courage she'd forgotten she possessed. "It was my infidelity. It was his insecurity. It was our cowardice in dealing with both. You were just the child who paid the price for adult failures you had nothing to do with." Leah stood and walked to the window that faced her small front yard. Where February light was fading early and her neighbors were coming home from work to families that presumably functioned with less drama than legal settlements required. Her reflection in the glass looked like her mother's, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin. The same expression of someone carrying weights too heavy for their frame. You want absolution, she said without turning around. I want you to understand that we're sorry. That we know what we did was wrong. That we want to fix whatever can still be fixed. Leah turned back to face the woman who had given birth to her, raised her, and spent 40 years participating in her systematic emotional exile. The face was familiar, but the context had shifted completely. This wasn't her mother asking for reconciliation. This was a co-conspirator confessing to crimes that had shaped the architecture of someone else's entire self-concept. The money fixes what can be fixed, Leah said quietly. College funds for Maisie, security for me, compensation for the inheritance that was stolen through favoritism. But it doesn't fix 40 years of wondering whether I was worthy of love or just tolerated out of obligation. Her mother nodded, tears making tracks down cheeks that had aged significantly during the months of legal battles. I know it's too late for that kind of repair. It's too late for repair. It's also too late for the kind of relationship where I pretend this conversation changes everything. Leah's voice carried the calm finality of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. I'm grateful you told me the real story. But gratitude isn't forgiveness, and understanding isn't reconciliation. What about Maisie? She's your granddaughter. She shouldn't pay for our mistakes. Leah thought about her daughter, who was currently at after-school care. And would come home later to a house where adults had finally spoken truths that should have been shared decades earlier. Maisie, who had learned too young that love could be conditional and family membership could be revoked without warning. Maisie will decide for herself what relationships she wants when she's old enough to understand what happened here. But she'll make that decision with full knowledge of family history, not the sanitized version that protects adult comfort at children's expense. Her mother stood as though preparing to leave, then paused at the hallway entrance. For whatever it's worth, you turned out to be a better person than we deserved. A better mother than I was. I had good motivation to break the pattern, Leah replied. After her mother left, Leah sat in her quiet living room and processed the conversation that had finally provided context for 62 years of feeling like she never quite belonged anywhere. The settlement would provide financial security, but this confession had provided something potentially more valuable: certainty that her perceptions had been accurate. Her instincts reliable, her sense of injustice completely justified. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't oversensitive. She wasn't failing some mysterious test of family worthiness. She had been systematically excluded from full family membership because adults had used a child as a scapegoat for their own failures. Then disguised their cruelty as uncertainty about biology that could have been resolved anytime with simple medical testing. That evening, when Maisie came home with homework and stories about playground politics and requests for help with math problems, Leah felt something she hadn't experienced before: complete clarity about what kind of family they were building together. Not perfect, not without struggles, but honest about their struggles, direct about their limitations, and absolutely certain that love wasn't conditional on genetic testing or trust fund balances or anyone's approval beyond their own. The settlement would be finalized next week. The legal battle would end with financial victory that felt more like archaeological discovery, unearthing evidence of systematic damage that had been buried under family politeness for decades. But tonight, in a small condo where two people ate dinner at a table that was exactly the right size for the family they'd chosen to be, justice felt less important than peace. And peace felt possible for the first time in 40 years. Part 8. 6 months later, Leah stood in the mortgage company's office in downtown Chicago, signing papers that would transform 30 years of monthly anxiety into owned property. The settlement money had hit her bank account in April, like a gentle earthquake, rearranging the financial landscape of her life with mathematical precision rather than dramatic flourish. The mortgage balance that had haunted her sleep was now a memory preserved only in filing cabinet folders. Property taxes were prepaid through next year. The heating system that had threatened to fail every winter had been replaced with efficient equipment that came with warranties and service contracts instead of prayer and emergency repair funds. Congratulations, Mrs. Martinez, the loan officer said, sliding the final documents across a desk that smelled like leather and official business. You own your home free and clear. Leah walked to her car with the deed in her purse, the paper feeling heavier than its physical weight suggested. At 62, she was finally building equity instead of paying rent, investing in her own stability instead of subsidizing someone else's retirement. The condo was small, nothing fancy, but it belonged to her and Maisie in ways that legal documents couldn't quite capture. The college savings account she'd opened for Maisie had grown beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Not enough for Harvard, maybe, but sufficient for State University. Tuition, books, and room and board at institutions that would judge her daughter by academic merit rather than genetic testing results. Educational opportunities that would be earned through study rather than family connections. Leah had kept her job at the medical office, processing insurance claims with the same careful attention. She'd always brought to work that required accuracy over inspiration. But the settlement money meant that employment was choice rather than survival, that sick days could be taken when needed. That retirement planning involved possibilities rather than poverty-level calculations. She attended the senior center lunch every Tuesday now, not as someone seeking charity or community support, but as someone offering both. The conversation flowed easily around tables where Medicare supplements and Social Security adjustments were discussed. With the practical expertise of people navigating systems designed by younger bureaucrats for older realities. "How's your granddaughter doing?" asked Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had Alzheimer's and whose own legal battles involved power of attorney disputes that made trust litigation seem simple. "She's good," Leah replied, stirring sugar into coffee that tasted better when shared with people who understood the specific challenges of aging in America. Growing too fast, asking questions that require Wikipedia to answer properly. The conversations at these lunches centered around problems that were universal: prescription costs that exceeded food budgets, family members who offered advice but not assistance, medical appointments that required translation from professional jargon into human language. But they also included solutions, resources, and the kind of practical wisdom that accumulated through decades of solving problems. With limited resources and infinite creativity, Leah had begun volunteering with the Senior Center's Legal Aid Clinic, helping other families navigate trust disputes, inheritance questions, and elder abuse situations that followed patterns she recognized from her own experience. Her story had become a case study in how family dynamics could disguise financial crimes, how legal documents could protect what emotional appeals couldn't enforce. "The thing about family money," she told a woman whose sons were systematically draining their father's accounts, "is that it's not actually about family. It's about money. Once you understand that, the solutions become clearer." At home, their small condo had been transformed through modest improvements that focused on safety and comfort rather than impressive aesthetics. New locks, better lighting, a security system that included cameras and monitoring services. Not because she expected trouble, but because peace of mind was worth the monthly fee to people who had learned that feeling secure was more valuable than appearing successful. Maisie's bedroom had been painted her favorite shade of purple, furnished with a desk where homework happened under task lighting that protected young eyes, decorated with achievements that were celebrated rather than criticized for not being better. The kitchen table where legal documents had been spread like evidence now hosted school projects, art supplies, and conversations about everything except family lawsuits. The most significant change was invisible: the absence of anxiety that had shaped 40 years of financial decision-making. Leah no longer checked her bank balance before grocery shopping, no longer calculated whether prescription copays could be delayed until next month's Social Security deposit, no longer chose between heating bills and health insurance premiums. Christmas had been different. They'd spent the holiday with Mrs. Patterson and her husband, along with 2 other families from the senior center whose relatives were either distant or difficult. The dining room table seated 8 comfortably. The conversation included people from different backgrounds who'd formed chosen family based on mutual respect rather than genetic accidents. Maisie helped serve dinner with the focused attention she brought to tasks that felt important, carrying plates carefully from kitchen to dining room, making sure everyone had enough gravy, collecting empty dishes with efficiency that made the adults smile. No one questioned her right to occupy any seat she chose. No one suggested she belonged somewhere else. "This is nice," she'd whispered to Leah during dessert, watching Mrs. Patterson's husband tells stories about his Navy service with the enthusiasm of someone whose memories were still vivid, despite disease that was stealing them incrementally. "This is how family is supposed to work," Leah had whispered back. The legal settlement had been finalized with paperwork rather than drama. Rebecca's final bill had been substantial but reasonable, her services having transformed 5 years of theft into mathematical justice that courts could enforce. Opposing counsel had retreated with professional dignity, their clients having learned expensive lessons about fiduciary duty and genetic testing. Leah received no contact from her parents after the settlement. No apology letters, no reconciliation attempts, no acknowledgement that legal resolution was different from relationship repair. She assumed they were processing their own consequences, reduced inheritance for Chelsea's family, legal fees that had probably exceeded their expectations, and the social discomfort of having financial crimes documented in court records. But their silence was its own kind of gift. No more performance art of family relationships that existed only when convenient for other people. No more emotional labor invested in earning approval that would never be offered sincerely. No more energy wasted on people who treated love as conditional rather than fundamental. One evening in late August, while Maisie worked on a school project about family history that she was approaching with more creativity than literal accuracy, Leah's phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity overrode caution. "Mrs. Martinez?" The voice belonged to a young woman who sounded nervous but determined. "This is Emma, Chelsea's daughter." Leah's breath caught. Her brother's granddaughter, now 15 years old, calling without permission or supervision from adults who had probably forbidden this conversation. "Hi, Emma. How are you?" "I'm okay. I wanted to." A pause, filled with the kind of silence that suggested careful word selection. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at Christmas. For sitting in Maisie's seat. For not saying anything when Grandpa hurt her." "Emma, you were 7 years old. Children aren't responsible for adult behavior." "I know, but I'm not 7 now. And I wanted you to know that I remember what happened, and I know it was wrong." Emma's voice grew stronger as she found her footing in difficult territory. "I also wanted to ask if maybe Maisie and I could be friends again. Not at family stuff, but just as cousins who actually like each other." Leah felt something shift in her chest, not reconciliation but recognition that patterns could be broken by people who chose to break them. Emma had grown up watching preferential treatment disguised as normal family dynamics. But she'd apparently developed enough perspective to question what she'd witnessed. "I think Maisie would like that very much," Leah said. "But it would have to be separate from family politics. Just you and her, building whatever kind of relationship you want to build." "That's what I hoped you'd say." After ending the call, Leah sat in her quiet living room and thought about generational change that happened incrementally. Through individual choices rather than dramatic gestures. Emma couldn't repair the damage done by her grandparents or parents, but she could choose to be different with her own generation. That choice mattered, perhaps more than legal settlements or family apologies that would never come. Maisie emerged from her bedroom with the family tree project. A creative interpretation that included adopted family, chosen family, and what she'd labeled heart family, people who treated each other with kindness regardless of genetic connections. "Does this look right?" she asked, showing Leah a poster board decorated with photographs, drawings, and careful handwriting that told their story with accuracy rather than traditional expectations. "It looks perfect," Leah said, meaning it completely. The diagram showed their small family at the center, connected to the senior center community. The medical office colleagues who had become friends, the neighbors who checked on them during winter storms, and even Emma listed as cousin who chose kindness, in Maisie's careful cursive. Missing from the diagram were the people who had spent years treating family membership as conditional rather than fundamental. Not edited out with anger, just absent in the way that irrelevant details were absent from stories about what actually mattered. That night, as August humidity settled over Chicago suburbs like a comfortable blanket, Leah stood at her kitchen window and looked out at a neighborhood where mortgage payments had been replaced by property taxes. Where financial security had created space for emotional healing, where legal victory had mattered less than the peace that followed it. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges, Medicare supplement renewals that required careful Reading, prescription costs that needed monitoring, the ongoing mathematics of living independently on fixed income supplemented by conservative investments. But they were manageable challenges, problems with solutions, temporary obstacles rather than permanent barriers to security. The trust settlement had provided more than money. It had provided proof that her instincts were reliable, her perceptions accurate, her right to equal treatment legally enforceable even when emotionally denied. Justice had arrived late but completely, transforming 40 years of doubt into documented certainty about who owed what to whom. But more importantly, it had created space for building something new. A family defined by choice rather than chance, love that was offered freely rather than earned through performance, relationships that were maintained because they brought joy rather than obligation. Maisie's laughter drifted from her bedroom, where she was probably reading past her bedtime but causing no harm that couldn't be forgiven. The sound filled their small home with the kind of happiness that couldn't be purchased or inherited. Or awarded by courts, only created through the daily choice to protect what mattered most. Outside their window, neighbors were finishing ordinary days in ordinary houses, probably unaware that justice had been served in the small condo. Where mortgage anxiety had been replaced by financial security. Where conditional love had been replaced by the absolute certainty of belonging exactly where they were meant to be. Life had taught Leah Martinez that some things broke beyond repair, that some people forfeited their right to forgiveness through consistent cruelty, that family wasn't defined by genetics, but by the choice to show up with kindness when kindness was needed most. The settlement money would provide practical security for years to come. But the peace that filled their small home tonight was worth more than any dollar amount, built through the quiet, daily practice of treating each other with the respect and love they had learned they deserved. For the first time in 62 years, Leah went to sleep without worrying about tomorrow's bills, next month's expenses, or whether she was good enough to deserve the security she'd finally achieved. Some victories were dramatic, others were as quiet as a house where two people knew they were loved completely, just as they were. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending